Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I am your host, Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. Thank you for joining me. Today, we're continuing our discussion on the commercial check ride ACS. And again, today we're not going to be diving into a specific portion of the ACS. This is still kind of part of the privileges and limitations and just all the things we need to understand about what it means to be a commercial pilot. And today we are specifically discussing what a wet lease is versus a dry lease. So let's go ahead, and we're going to be referring to a specific advisory circular. These advisory circulars sure do come in handy for these types of things. This advisory circular is AC 91-37B. Bravo. It states, this advisory circular provides information and guidance for lessees and conditional buyers of U.S. registered aircraft. Okay, so this is about what is called truth in leasing. All right. So we're going to be talking all about leasing today and what it means to have operational control and all this good stuff. So if we look at the introduction here, it states that operational control is not dependent on aircraft size or the number of aircraft operated. It is instead a matter of legal responsibility. There are instances where lessees and conditional buyers of aircraft did not realize that they were legally responsible for operational control of the aircraft as defined by Title 14. In other cases, even if the lessee or conditional buyer did realize it, very few recognize their responsibilities for compliance with regulations. If you or your company, school, club, athletic team, fraternity, social, or other group are planning to charter an airplane, take a moment to learn about chartered and leased aircraft and how to use them safely to your best advantage. That's what the introduction to this AC states. All right, let's keep going here. First of all, we'll read here. It says, to legitimately engage in charter air service, a company must be FAA certificated as a 14 CFR Part 121, 125, or 135 operation. No one may legally offer charter air service for compensation or hire unless he or she has a valid air carrier or operating certificate issued by the FAA. See, that's one thing I don't know if I've made clear in these previous episodes when we're talking about the types of things you can or can't do as a commercial pilot. You know, when we're talking about like the exceptions in 119.1 Echo and things like that as to whether you need an air carrier certificate or not, we've got to separate these into two different things. There is being a pilot, having a commercial or ATP pilot certificate with an appropriate medical, and then there's being an operator or an air carrier, right? The business that operates and conducts the business. Now, sometimes you as the pilot may be that business. If you're the airplane owner and trying to offer services, then you are the operator. But in general, what you can do as a commercial pilot versus the types of certificates and operating authorizations you need, those things come down to the operator and the airplane owner. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. One paragraph worth reading in this regard actually comes from AC 61-142. And this is paragraph 6.3. It says, distinction between pilot privileges and operational authority. It states the privileges and limitations conferred upon pilots are separate and distinct from the operational authority required to conduct the flights. A person who holds an ATP certificate or a commercial pilot certificate may act as PIC of an aircraft operated for compensation or hire and may carry persons or property for compensation or hire. However, most of these commercial operations require the operator to hold a certificate under Part 119 authorizing such operations. Okay? So again, two separate things, being the pilot and having a commercial pilot certificate versus being an operator. And we're going to dive more into that here. So let's go back to our 9137 Bravo, and we're going to look at some definitions. This definition is for the word lease. Okay, so the word lease, for the purpose of Part 91, a lease means any agreement by a person to furnish an aircraft to another person for compensation or hire, with or without flight crew members. That is not a contract of conditional sale. Okay, in other words, one person's going to give the use of an aircraft to another person. That may include some crew members for that plane. It may not, but it has nothing to do with selling the aircraft to that person. It goes on to say the person furnishing the aircraft is referred to as the lessor, and the person to whom it is furnished is referred to as the lessee. All right, moving on to our next definition of operational control. Operational control, it says, is defined as, with respect to a flight, means the exercise of authority over initiating, conducting, or terminating a flight. Operational control involves three basic areas: aircrew, aircraft, and flight management. These areas, summarized below, are intended to give a general understanding of operational control. When chartering an aircraft, the charter air carrier has operational control and is responsible for regulatory compliance and the safety of the flight. When an aircraft lessee operates an aircraft under general operating rules, the lessee accepts operational control responsibilities. Operational control is an important regulatory concept for lessees to understand, and it is explained more in detail, blah, 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 later on. All right, guys, types of leases. Let's get into this. It says a lease involving an aircraft is sometimes referred to as a wet lease or a dry lease. It says a wet lease is described as any leasing arrangement whereby a person agrees to provide an entire aircraft and at least one crew member. That crew member could be a pilot. It could be a flight attendant. Heck, it could be a mechanic. Okay? If that mechanic, I guess, is on board. I don't know. But it doesn't matter who it is. It's not necessarily the pilot. It could be any flight crew member. That would make it a wet lease. Now, it's important to recognize that there's some confusion sometimes around this term because as student pilots and as aircraft renters, we are familiar with the idea of a wet rental. When you go and you rent an aircraft wet, that typically implies that fuel is included with the base rental price. If you rent an aircraft dry, it means that you're only paying for the aircraft and you're going to pay for fuel and oil separately out of your own pocket. So keep in mind that these are two different things. When we're talking wet leases versus dry leases, we're talking about an aircraft that's leased to a third party with or without crew members. When we're talking about wet versus dry rentals, usually in the GA world, that is what has to do with whether fuel is included in the base price or not. All right, let's keep going. Here it says, normally, in the case of a dry lease, the lessee, the person renting the aircraft essentially, the lessee exercises operational control of the aircraft. Conversely, in a wet lease, the lessor normally exercises operational control. The determination in each situation as to whether the lessor or lessee exercises operational control requires consideration of all relevant factors present in each situation. All right? It says the terms of the lease itself are important, but since they may not reflect the true situation, the actual arrangements and responsibilities should be given very careful consideration. In other words, if you go in to rent or lease an aircraft, you need to make sure that everything is in writing and everyone is on the same page as far as, hey, what's being included with this? Who's making these decisions, right? Decisions such as when we fly and when we don't, okay? Because that's what being in operational control is all about. All right, moving on to 6.1. It says, when dry leasing, you do not need an FAA-issued operator certificate as long as you do not carry persons or property for compensation or hire. However, for larger aircraft operating under Part 125, it says please review 125.1, blah, 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 blah. Basically, if you were going to be operating a larger aircraft under Part 125, it says you need to know how to maintain and operate the aircraft in accordance with the regulations, because the minimum safety standards for that type of lease when operated under Part 125 are different and obviously more stringent than if you are not operating under Part 125 and not operating with paying passengers. So let's pause for a minute and talk about, why do you as a pilot even need to know this? If you're not planning on owning and operating an aircraft or charter service, why is this relevant to you as a commercial pilot? Well, the answer to that is simply, if you get presented with an opportunity to go fly for somebody, and what they are doing or offering to either the general public or even just private parties kind of skirts the line between being a public charter versus a private operation, I mean, you need to know the responsibilities of the company you're working for and make sure that they are upholding those responsibilities. Otherwise, you as the pilot could get caught up in the legal battle that might ensue should things go sideways. So it's important for you to understand these different types of leasing and make sure you are flying for a reputable company who's doing things the right way, and not somebody who's trying to skirt the rules and possibly getting you in trouble along with them. So here it goes on to say that some groups seeking charter air services may knowingly enter into an evasively worded arrangement if the price is made attractively low. Always a red flag, right? If you are tempted to do so, consider that if you accept what amounts to charter service from a company that is not certificated to operate charter flights, you may forego the protection of certain safety standards required by the FAA. You may also violate the law. Regardless of how the lease is named, there are a few questions that can clarify who will remain in operational control, okay, or who will maintain operational control. So these are questions that you as a pilot could be asking just as much as the customer or the lessee could be asking these questions. 1, who makes the decision to assign crew members and aircraft, accept flight requests, and initiate, conduct, and terminate flights? Okay, who's making those decisions? Okay, number 2, for whom do the pilots work as direct employees or agents? All right. Number 3, who is maintaining the aircraft and where is it maintained? And number 4, prior to departure, who ensures the flight, aircraft, and crew comply with regulations? Okay, who's overseeing the crew? Let's see. 5, who decides when and where maintenance is accomplished and who directly pays for the maintenance? 6, who determines weather/fuel requirements and who directly pays for the fuel? And 7, who directly pays for the airport fees, parking/hangar costs, food service, and or rental cars? Okay. These are all questions that certainly somebody leasing an aircraft should ask, but also you as the pilot should ask. For instance, if we go back up to number 2, for whom do the pilots work as employees or agents? Well, if you are working for your boss who owns the plane, great. But then if that boss starts to charge other people to fly on the plane with you as the pilot, that's not going to work out very well. So as much as it's important for those customers, for those lessees to confirm that you do in fact work for him and that therefore this would be a wet lease arrangement and you need to have certain operating certificates, it's also just as important for you to make sure that your boss isn't having you fly people around that he is charging for those services, okay? There are 2 notes following these listed items. It says, note 1, if you are responsible for any of the criteria listed above, then you have some operational control. and should clarify your leasing arrangements accordingly, or you will be held accountable for violations. Okay? Note 2, it says if you are not responsible for any or all of the criteria listed above, then you do not have operational control and the aircraft is a wet lease, requiring full compliance with the provisions of Part 135. Okay? So, in summary, wet lease is when the aircraft is provided with at least one crew member, and a dry lease is when it's just the aircraft provided, and basically the lessee needs to provide their own crew to operate that aircraft. It also comes down to who has and maintains operational control, and you want to make sure that you're aware of who is maintaining operational control for any aircraft you either lease or for any owner you go to work for. Hey, that will about do it for today, guys. I hope this has been helpful. As always, please like and subscribe if you're here on YouTube. Follow the show and leave me a review. A 5-star review would be great if you are listening out there in podcast land. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.